every major event, it's amazing, in the life of a tiny nation, Israel, it's dramatically impacted the world. So, what's going to happen next? And how will it change your life? Next on this edition of It's Supernatural.
Centuries have come and gone, offering wisdom and understanding throughout the ages. Today, there should be nothing beyond one's power to discover. And yet the strange, unusual, and mysterious world of the supernatural defies understanding. Stay tuned for a unique and powerful investigation into a curious, undiscovered universe, only on It's Supernatural.
Hello, Sid Roth, your investigative reporter. As an investigative reporter, I am so fascinated with spiritual principles that are going on in the invisible world that affect our world. I mean, let's face it, our world's in trouble. Fear is epidemic. People are concerned about what's going to happen with disease, what's going to happen with terrorist bombers, what's going to happen with our economy. But if we can get some insight from the invisible world, we can have an edge. And I have found a spiritual law. First the natural, then the spiritual. If we look at the natural, we get insight into the supernatural. Let me give you an example. What major event happened in Israel that dramatically affected the world, that caused literally an explosive release of God's Spirit on planet Earth? I'm talking about Pentecost, or in Hebrew, Shavuot. Well, you know what happened. Jesus died, and he rose from the dead. So, every major event that happens in that tiny little nation of Israel has a dramatic impact on the Spirit of God. Jesus died and rose from the dead. Explosion of the Holy Spirit, what is known as Pentecost. 1898, again, first the natural. What happens in natural Israel? Then the supernatural. The Spirit of God is released. 1898, what happened? That was when the first Zionist Congress was established. A Zionist believes that the Jewish people are entitled to the land of Israel unconditionally and forever. The first Zionist, I might add, was not Theodor Herzl, who had the Zionist conference in 1898. The first Zionist was no other than God. This is what happened in 1898. They had this conference. We must have a land, a modern-day land of Israel. So what happened in 1900? First the natural, then the spiritual. Nothing short of the Pentecostal revival. Pretty good. But look at this. What happened in 1948 in the natural? In 1948, Israel became a nation. So what happened in the supernatural? In 1948, we had what was known as the healing revival. Over 100 men and women were instantly raised up with tents, moving throughout the United States with the greatest creative miracles and signs and wonders. People like William Branham, T.L. Osborne, Kenneth Hagin. Do you know who else came on the scene in 1948? Billy Graham. First the natural, Israel became a modern-day nation. Then from the invisible world, a move of God, supernatural, the Spirit of God, the great healing revival. Next year, 1967. I mean, I'm talking about the most dramatic times in the history of that tiny little nation, Israel. First the natural. What happened in 1967? For the first time in 2,000 years, Jerusalem was a Jewish possession. That's major in the natural. So what happened in the supernatural? Anyone ever hear of the charismatic renewal? The Catholic charismatics, the Jesus movement? All happened in 1967. We can go from event to event and see that every time something major happens to natural Israel, something supernatural happens to an outpouring of God's Spirit. I'm interested in miracles. I want to see more miracles. And God said to Moses, when the pattern is right, the glory comes down. His exact words were, do everything according to the pattern. And when that pattern is right, the glory of God will come down. So what is next? What's the next thing that's going to happen to that tiny little nation of Israel? Because I tell you that it's going to have an impact of revival like the world has never seen before. I tell you that I know when that next event will occur. I know what that next event will be. And I know what the catalyst will be to cause it to happen. I'll talk about that and much, much more right after this break. Be right back. Hello, Sid Roth, your investigative reporter. I love uncovering mysteries. That's what an investigative reporter is supposed to do. And in the Bible, there are mysteries, but there should not be mysteries for God's children. Now, in recent years, we've uncovered mysteries having to do with healing. We call them laws of healing. Mysteries involving finances. We call them laws of finances. But what about the most important mystery in the Bible? What about souls? Proverbs says, he who wins souls is wise. The only thing anyone takes to heaven with them is not their money. Certainly not. Not even their health. It doesn't matter what your health is because there's no sickness in heaven. The only thing you take to heaven is souls. That's why he who wins souls is wise. And in recent years, I have found that there is a law of salvation throughout the whole Bible. Let me tell you how it works. God's kingdom operates as a seed. Whatever you sow, you will reap. He has put certain promises on certain seeds. For instance, on Jewish people in Genesis, the 12th chapter, the 3rd verse, God says, I, God, will bless those who bless the Jewish people and curse those who curse them. And since whatever you sow, you reap, when you reach out in evangelism to the Jew, you're literally planting a seed to reap a harvest of non-Jews. Let me show you how this works. The first person that worked on this principle was God himself. God wanted to bless the whole world. So he picked Abram and made him the first Jew to plant a seed of blessing, if you will, on the earth. Jesus understood the principle and did the same thing. Jesus said, I come only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not as an end in itself, as we know by history, but to plant a seed to reach the whole world. Paul perhaps summarized this better than anyone else. In Romans, the 1st chapter, the 16th verse, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm plain not ashamed, because you see, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first. Again, not an end in itself, not just a historical order, but to plant a seed of blessing of Genesis 12:3 to bless the entire earth. I have found that this law is true. When I reach out to the Jew first, I will reach more Gentiles than if I just reach out to Gentiles. It's called the law of evangelism. I like to use a word called mishpacha. It's a Hebrew word, and it means family. God likes to use that word too. And let me explain to you the family God is establishing. You see, in Romans, the 11th chapter, God talks about his family involving Jewish people, but he also speaks in the Old Covenant in Malachi about his family. And he speaks about the last days which we're living in. Let me read this to you. Malachi, the 4th chapter, verse 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, Well, we know John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah, but before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the spirit of Elijah will go not just on John the Baptist, but on all believers to do one specific thing. And this is what Malachi says in the 6th verse. This spirit of Elijah will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. Well, Paul told us his spiritual definition of the fathers in Romans, the 9th chapter. He said, we owe a debt of gratitude to the Jewish people because of them is the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And even in the 5th commandment, God tells us to honor our mothers and fathers. Well, if the fathers represent the Jewish people, who do the children represent? The Christians. So what is God saying? That the spirit of Elijah will come on the church and it will turn the hearts of the Jewish people to the Christians and the hearts of the Christians to the Jewish people, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. Well, I don't want to curse, but you realize if the hearts of the Christians become mishpacha, family with the Jews, and the hearts of the Jews become mishpacha, family with the Christians, the blessings that will be established. I have 2 books here that are so important. These 2 books, the first came from a dream. And in this dream, God spoke to me and he said, Sid, and I don't have many dreams where God literally speaks to me. I can number them on this hand. But in this dream, God said, Sid, more Jewish people have come to know you as a result of your book than anything you've ever done. And I said to the Lord, I had the audacity to say to God, but it was a dream. I said to the Lord, oh, my testimony book, it's finally taken off. And he said, no, Sid, your book of Jewish testimonies. And before I could tell him I didn't have a book of Jewish testimonies, I woke up and the light bulbs went on. And guess what? We came out with a book called They Thought for Themselves. 10 Jewish people from different walks of life, a multimillionaire, a Holocaust survivor, a PhD, a concert pianist, all came to the conclusion. The stories are so fascinating of miracles that Jewish people will read it from cover to cover. I am told that this book is the most successful evangelistic book for Jewish people in the streets of Jerusalem. As we're speaking now, it's being handed out. The leaders love this book. It's their favorite book to distribute. In Russia, we have mailed this to every single Jewish household, the Russian edition of this book, to every single Jewish household in St. Petersburg, Russia, in Moscow, Russia. We're now mailing it to Jewish households in Siberia. And we have a problem with this book, by the way. The requests for it from Jewish people, we've printed some 400,000 of these books in the Russian language. Do you realize the fruit that's coming from this Russian edition? And I have the English edition here right now, but the requests are so many, we've run out of print. We need the money to print this, especially the Russian edition and the Hebrew edition, and it's now being translated into its 7th language. You see, when you are obedient to God, I thought the last thing in the world the world needs is a book of 10 Jewish testimonies, but all of the truth is worked into these fascinating stories. I want you to get a copy of this book and give it to the Jewish person God has had cross your path so you can walk in Genesis 12:3, so that your family, your Gentile family, will come to know the Messiah. And I also have a book called The Last Lap. This book here is mandatory reading. If you like the teaching you're receiving on this edition of It's Supernatural, you'll want to go into depth. People that understand end times. Well, for instance, let me read this to you. Pastor Steve Gray from the Great Smithton Outpouring says, this book prophetically proclaims an outline for the next move of God. Paul Wilbur, recording artist for Integrity Music, says, passionate, prophetic, and right on time. To miss the understanding contained here of the one new man is to miss the purpose of God for these last days. Hello, Sid Roth, your investigative reporter, and I'm showing you something that you should know by now that is so close to the heart of God. It involves the one new man. Paul talked about it, and he said in the book of Ephesians, the 2nd chapter, that the reason Jesus came was to break down the wall of separation between Jews and Gentiles. Today, there's a greater wall of separation between Jews and Christians than we have between Jews and Gentiles. And this is why Jesus came. Why? What's at stake? I tell you what's at stake, the salvation of the world. Paul put it this way. Paul said, if it was a blessing that the Jewish people rejected their Messiah, and it was, Gentiles could be grafted in. And not only that, the Jews, because the sins were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and wherever they went, based on how the country treated them, they became a blessing or a curse to that country. But if it was a blessing when the Jewish people rejected their Messiah, how much greater blessing when they received their Messiah? It'll literally cause resurrection, life from the dead. We're going to see the return of the Messiah. Jesus said, I'll not return until the Jewish people say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But even more important than the return of Jesus is souls. That's what's at stake. Let me read to you in Amos, the 9th chapter, the 11th verse. On that day, I will raise up the tabernacle of David. And in the Hebrew, tabernacle could mean family or house, is what it means. In other words, the Jewish people, the family of David. So on that day, I will raise up the family of David, the Jewish people, which have fallen down, and I will repair their damages, and I will raise up their ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Do you get it? When Jewish people are raised up to know God, then it will supernaturally cause a release of God's Spirit for what Amos calls the greatest revival in history. He goes on to say in the 13th verse, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes, him who sows seed. In other words, the seed time and the harvest will be so great they'll plant seeds and they'll still be collecting the crops from the harvest. There won't be enough helpers. You're going to have to build more congregations and have more believers because there's going to be so much fruit. There's never been a time like that in history. When the family of David is restored. You see what's at stake. Now, the question I have to you is, we started out with 100% Jewish church. Today, the average Christian looks at Judaism and says, I don't see anything Christian in Judaism. And the average Jewish person looks at Christianity and says, I don't see anything Jewish in Christianity. How come the two have been divided? And Jesus said, I've come that wall of separation would come down so there can be one new man. The Jew, Jesus, the King of the Jews, he's the one new man. How did all of this happen? Satanic. It's diabolical. The early church literally made it a crime to observe biblical festivals. They didn't understand what biblical festivals meant. And the legalists said, if you do these biblical festivals, you're under the law. The word law means Torah or instructions. You're under God's instructions. Could that be so bad? And others went on the other religious side of the ditch and said, if you don't observe these festivals, you don't go to heaven. No, it's got nothing to do with going to heaven. Repentance of sin and belief in Jesus is the only thing necessary to go to heaven. But it's got to do with supernatural blessings. You see, the Jewish people in the Old Covenant, when they observed the biblical festivals, they were because of times of thanksgiving to God for His blessings. And it literally says they stopped observing the biblical festivals when the blessings stopped. So let's get God's understanding of these festivals. It says in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, the 2nd verse, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord. Interesting. The word feasts means the appointments, the set appointments with God. The set appointments with God. How would you like to have a set appointment with God? Which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, rehearsals, These are my feasts. The word convocation means rehearsals. Let's read them with understanding now. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the set appointments of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy rehearsals, these are my set appointments. So they're not just biblical set appointments, not just Jewish set appointments, they're God's. Rehearsals of what? First 3 festivals rehearsed His first coming. Last 3, His return. If we don't have the rehearsal, we'll have a bad play. If we don't have the rehearsal, we won't have insight into what's about ready to happen. Would you like to know what's about ready to happen? These biblical festivals will be the greatest blessings of the year. They'll be God parties. They will provoke Jews to jealousy. Romans 11:11 says salvation has come to the Gentile to provoke the Jew to jealousy. They won't be legalistic. It won't be like Orthodox Jews. They'll be so pregnant with the Spirit of God. They're going to be so exciting. So what's going to happen next? The prophet Joel tells us what's going to happen next. First, the natural. It says the whole world, in the 3rd chapter of Joel, will come against Israel, and God will judge all of the nations that come against Israel for one sin and one sin only, dividing up His land. When you see the land of Israel divided up and given away that God promised to the Jewish people, at that point, you're going to find all nations will be judged. But before that happens, in the 2nd chapter of Joel, there'll be a great Jewish revival. And I'll tell you what's ready to happen. The Jewish revival is going to be the catalyst for the greatest revival the world has ever seen. Exactly what Amos was talking about. So get ready, because the truth of the matter is the Jew needs the Christian, and the Christian needs the Jew. And the two of us, when we come together, we form that one new man in Jesus, and the world will no longer make fun of us, because the glory, Jesus said, I pray that Jew and Gentile, they may be one, so the world will believe. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah. I'm ready to party. Come along, let's have a party.
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's Lord, one in Yeshua's Lord.
Get ready now, go!
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's Lord. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's Lord. Help us, Father, to love one another with humble hearts, forgiving each other, heal our wounds, bind us together, so the world might believe. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua's love.